Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all going well. And it's nice that the air cons are on, isn't it? It's quite a hot day out there. If you have been around here for the past few weeks, you would know that we are taking time in the book of John. And one of the beautiful things about the book of John is that Jesus makes these 7 statements, these I am statements, these identity statements that don't just reveal who he was to those people back then, but it's a divine reality that we can listen to and take note of today as well. So today we are exploring the statement, I am the gate. So in your translations, it might be I am the door, either or, they both work. So I'm going to invite Tess up. She's going to come and do the reading for us. And we're going to be reading from John 10, verses 1 to 10. And today, hopefully by the end, we'll be able to see how Jesus is the gate to God and he's the gate to life abundant in God. So Tess, over to you.
Our reading is John 10, verses 1 to 10. I tell you the truth, the man who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The man who enters by the gate is the shepherd of his sheep. The watchman opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Jesus used this figure of speech, but they did not understand what he was telling them. Therefore, Jesus said again, I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. All who ever came before me were thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. He will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full.
Thanks so much, Tess. Appreciate that. So last week, Colin got up here and he shared about the Good Shepherd. So what we learnt last week is that this term Good Shepherd perhaps means something a little bit different to us than it did to people back then. Back then, the Good Shepherd was it was a common role in society, a common job for people that they were to be a shepherd. And so people knew what Jesus was on about when they were talking about that. They knew that it meant that the shepherd looked after the sheep. They knew that it meant that there was a caring role for the shepherd. They knew that it meant protection. It meant also this level of intimacy with the sheep. That there was these records that the shepherds would literally name the sheep by name. Such was their relationship, their closeness to the sheep. And in doing some looking around for what the gate means, the gate, from what I was looking at, almost feels like a bit of a subsection to the Good Shepherd. So today, if you could just keep in the back of your mind what Colin was speaking about last week. Hopefully, if you weren't here last week, that's okay. It will still make sense. But it's in that broader context. But if I say to you, what is a gatekeeper? I think your idea of what a gatekeeper would probably be not super different to what they were thinking back then. See, the idea of a gatekeeper is maybe your mind might go to the goalkeeper in netball who might protect the goal to make sure nothing gets in. Or maybe your mind might go to a security guard at an event, making sure that the dodgy characters stay out and that the guys inside have a good time. Or when I was thinking about it, I was it's kind of like the dragon in Shrek, when they were trying to go get Fiona, but the dragon was trying to protect them. Didn't do a good job, but it's that similar sense of there's a figure there with that would affect the lives of the people inside and outside of their protection. So if we look at verse 7, today I'm going to be mainly focusing on verses 7 to 10. When Jesus says, I am the gate for the sheep, it's not a big jump for us to realize that he is saying that he is the only way to being a part of God's flock, God's people. I can imagine a lot of us in this room have a faith, and maybe have had a faith for a long time. And maybe us calling Jesus the only way to spiritual life, the only way to relationship with God, might just feel like a bit of a no-brainer. But for many of our friends, and maybe many people who aren't in this room who we know and love, Jesus may feel like an option amongst many. So in a world where multiple views are accepted for what truth is, this is actually quite a radical statement here for us today, that Jesus is saying that he's the only way to relationship with God. I remember growing up, being around many people with strong faiths and who believe the statement that Jesus is the only way to relationship with God. Jesus is the gate to God. And I think when I hadn't made that commitment yet, when I didn't fully understand what Jesus' role was as the gate, I remember thinking that this sentiment that Jesus is the only way at times felt a bit harsh. Like in my younger brain, I was like, don't you need to just consider other people's perspectives? Maybe they understand it. And I think that's true. I think we should be still doing that. And I think for me back then, when I heard this statement, it just felt like a little black and white. And so for this first bit, I just wonder if you're in this room and you're questioning that, whether this statement for you that Jesus is the only way to relationship with God, the only way to life itself really is what we're saying. Maybe does that feel a bit harsh? But I think this passage has a beautiful thing for us to consider together in speaking to this. So if you look at this passage in John 10, it's on the backdrop of this incredible story that happens in John 9. And I think it illuminates for us why this statement that Jesus is the way, the gate to God, as being so significant. So chapter 9 is about this story of a blind man who had been blind his whole life. You can just imagine how much that would impact his life. And he encounters Jesus, Jesus heals him, and then he turns into a bit of an evangelist and is just like, whoa, Jesus healed me, it's crazy. And so then John, when constructing the book of John in chapter 10, he uses this narrative of the gate almost to illuminate to the readers what was happening in the story of the blind man. See, the author used this narrative of the gate as a metaphor to illuminate this spiritual truth. That in Jesus' day, when people were reading this, they would have equated this physical healing of a blind man, not with just this physical metaphor, but this spiritual reality. So after he healed the blind man encountered some religious leaders of the day, and he says this in John 9, verse 32. He says, "Never since the world begun has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind." Never in the whole Old Testament, never in human history has someone been able to redeem our spiritual state until Jesus. Jesus is the only one who has the ability to take us from spiritual darkness to spiritual light, to take us from a path that is on the way to death to life in relationship with the Good Shepherd, to life itself. He is the only one in history who can do that. And this is partially why these people in your life that you might feel are a bit black and white can confidently and with conviction say that Jesus is the gate to God, because he's the only one that can overcome the death and darkness that separate us. So he's not just this hinge point in human history, he's the hinge point in many of our lives. And this is why Jesus saying that he's the gate is significant. He's the only way to God, and the only way to relationship with God. So back to my friends who might be considering that Jesus might not be the only way to God. What I would say to my younger self, and perhaps you in the room, I would say, I think this passage invites us to consider that there's a bigger picture going on. And that this spiritual walk that we're on, that there's these two paths. And this idea that Jesus is the gate invites us to consider, what does that mean for us? So I think for us, it's all very well saying that Jesus is the gate to God, but how is he the gate to God? If you want to flick to verse 9, he says this. He says, I am the gate, which has been established. Great. Whoever enters through me will be saved. So based on this passage, what does him saving us look like through this gate lens? I think going back culturally to understanding who the shepherd was, when Jesus was talking about this passage to this group of people that he was speaking to, it was at a time of year that was perhaps a little bit chilly, and they would know that for the shepherd, part of their role to look after the sheep is that at night they would gather the sheep and they would walk the sheep to this enclosure, and this enclosure would have these really high walls, and some of them would have spikes and stuff on top to keep the robbers and stuff out. And there would be in this enclosure where the sheep can sleep and relax and, recharge, there would be this archway that what the shepherd would do to keep predators out, which was a big issue in their day, and thieves out. The shepherd would literally lie down in the doorway, becoming the gate. So when he's saying, I am the gate, this is the picture that is kind of coming to their minds. That the shepherd would literally lay down his life for the sake of the sheep, acting as the gate. This line, laying down his life for the sake of the sheep, pops up in either direct language or indirect language 5 times in the verses that follow verse 10 to 20, what Colin spoke on last week. See, Jesus is the gate has this implication that he also saves us, which is what verse 9 kind of goes on about. John 15 verse 3 says, greater love has no other than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. Paul in Romans reflects on the cross saying, but God demonstrates his own love for us, that while we were still sinners, while we were still in spiritual darkness, Christ died for us so that we can be part of the flock. See, Jesus is the only gate to life because he's the only one that can save us, the only one that can cure our spiritual blindness. And so in this way, Jesus is the entryway to life. So what does this mean for us? I think it presents us with this invitation, particularly for us who don't know him, to consider what does Jesus being the gateway to relationship with God mean for us? Do we trust that he is who he says he is? And that he has the ability to overcome evil and restore us to the Father? But is that it? Is that the whole picture of what Jesus being the gate is on about? See, this gate imagery, I think, means a little bit more. So let's read verses 9b and 10 together. So in 9b and 10, it says, they will come in, talking about the sheep, and go out. So this is God's flock, the ones who are under his care. They will come in and go out and find pasture. And then this verse that many of us probably know off by heart, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy, and I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. See, Jesus is not just that initial gate to God, but also the gate to abundant life in God. When Jesus says that I have come to give life and give it to the full, I want us to take some time now to consider, what does that mean? So a few of us in this room probably were here last Sunday night, where we kicked off Alpha Plus sessions, and as a part of that, we watched a video done by the Alpha series on this question of the problem of evil. As a part of that, there was a guy who experienced some pretty intense things in his life, which evidently, such as in verse 10, there was things in his life that kind of wrecked relationships and were quite intense, quite difficult. Feel free to look at the video yourself for that one. And eventually what happened to him is that he got in a fight and it led him to be in a hospital where he was pronounced dead, like he was literally dead. And then some people came and they prayed for him a few days later, and this guy ended up coming back to life, not just physically, but also spiritually coming back to life. And one thing that shocked everyone around him is they were saying, this guy is just a completely different guy. Like his whole persona changed, his whole way he related to people changed. He left things behind that were people just saw as part of his life. And it's not just for the fact of the actions that he was changing, but in essence, it was like he was a different person. And whilst this is quite a dramatic testimony, and I'm sure that maybe some of us know those kind of stories, or maybe have experienced still those stories of coming to Christ and seeing that change. I think this kind of gives us clues to what the nature of this life is. See, in Paul in Romans talks about what being alive in Christ is, that the old has passed away and the new is here. So I think this passage gives us some clues as to what this new life is, what this flock life is that we get to enjoy together. So what is flock life like? Firstly, grazing in pastures. So you'll notice in verse 9, he speaks about how the sheep will go out and come in and find pastures. Doesn't this just evoke that like Psalm 23 passage for you, where David is recalling how God, the relationship with God, is one that restores our soul? This restoration, this sustaining is part of what the nature of our relationship with God is. And so this is part of what it means to be part of the flock. So we're taken care of, and we now get to enjoy this life of being sustained spiritually in Him. But that's not all this passage is speaking about. Verse 10, as you will see, says, "The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. And I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." Here Jesus is setting up this very clear contrast for us. That we see that in this immediate context, these thieves were considered to be like anti-shepherds, as Colin talked about last week, that these people with these motives that were really for themselves, that these people were living in spiritual darkness, you could say, in contrast to God, whose motives were completely different here. And so you could say that broadly though, for them to be in spiritual darkness, you can see that the thief ultimately is the enemy. So here, he's saying that the thief has an agenda for your life, which leads to death, but I also have an agenda for your life, which leads to life abundant. And this word for the fullness of life is like this, it could be translated as like superabundance, like super full. Like a glass that's like got too much water in it, that it's kind of coming out, like it's just full. And in a similar way, you hear Jesus speaking about this concept throughout the rest of John, saying, I am the living water. I am the one that's going to sustain you. I am the bread of life. It's all pointing to the same idea that spiritual life, fullness of spiritual life, is found in Him. So I think for us who are seasoned believers, I think sometimes it can be hard to think about, or hard to remember that this is kind of what's going on in the background. that God has an agenda for our life to bring life and life to the full, and the enemy doesn't. So then I think the gate here, Jesus saying that he's the gate, is that he's saying that he will always be the gate to life. That he's not just the gate to life when you first came to know him, but in the everyday, he is the way to life. So it's this conviction that Jesus is the abundance of life. And following him and abiding in him is the fullness of life that's offered to us. Recently, I've been reading through the book of 1 John, and I've been reminded of the idea that abiding in Jesus is a lot more about obedience than just like sitting still in the word in time with God. Like, that's part of it, but what does it look like to follow Jesus in his footsteps? In Mark, you see this line of take up your cross and follow me. So whilst we have this image of the sheep grazing, in context of the larger New Testament, this idea of following him, even when it's difficult, he's saying it will be difficult. He's saying it's not going to be a walk in the park, but he's saying that this is the way that he's come to give life and life to the full. If we're following in his footsteps, we are also, like Jesus, laying down our life for the sake of loving God and loving others. And I think this is the heart of what he wants for us in our lives. But I think we do this by recognizing that he is the way to life. Even when other things are competing or drawing our attention away, he is our way. He is the way to life. So why is this important? I remember in uni, I had a lecturer who would always quote Martin Luther when Martin Luther said we're all kind of bent away from Christ. Like, we have this internal bent that means that it's not just like you wake up one morning and you're just like super amazing at following Jesus, like you're 10 out of 10. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that this path of following Jesus is that he speaks to that part of us that doesn't necessarily want to submit. And this is the process of how he forms us. And so I think it's being conscious of that tension, but also recognizing in that tension that we still have those options, the path to life or not. So in light of this, also out of a uni subject that I was doing on pastoral care, I had a little chat with Rob. I'm going to bring this up because Rob's not in the room, so he can talk to me about it later. That's okay. So I was chatting with Rob, and as you guys know, he's quite like a wise soul. And I was asking him, I had to have a think about what was the question that I asked him for this assignment. It was, what do you think is important for people to understand in their spiritual lives? Or something to the effect of that. It was like in my first year, so it was like a few years ago. But for him, this take up your cross and follow me is always a significant thing that he talks about. But also, he was talking about this tension that we can experience in following Jesus. And he was reflecting on Romans 12, 1-2, which speaks about people who know Jesus walking with him, this idea that we're living sacrifices, and that is that he's transforming us to not conform in the pattern of the world, but to be renewed by him. And in reflecting on that, I think he was quoting Moody here, but he was talking about how the problem with living sacrifices is they keep rolling off the altar. And that's just stuck in my brain because I think it kind of displays this tension of we find ourselves often in places where we might have moved away to from the life that God is offering us here, that brings us to a greater love of him and a greater love of others here. But this is the walk of Jesus, following Jesus. And this is the invitation to turn to him and to see him as the gate to abundant life. So I think following Jesus here is knowing that he's the gate overall, and he's the gate to our life in every moment, which will probably be more often than not, might be in the midst of very difficult circumstances when you don't want to follow him and do the hard thing potentially, or sometimes it might feel really easy. I don't know where what you're walking into this room with today. But I think having this conviction that the fullness of life is only found in Christ is one that will do us a lot of good. I think. And I think I see that in a lot of you here today. So for us followers of Jesus, seeing him as the gate to life, not just initially, but in every moment, is, I think, how he sustains us and how he operates as shepherd with us here today. And is that kind of Psalm 23 mentality. So I wonder what's popping into your mind today when it comes to that. Where is Jesus inviting you to consider that his ways are better? So let me pray, and then I think the band's going to come up. Okay. Jesus, we thank you that you are the gate, that we can't open our own eyes, but Jesus, you're here that heal us, that you heal our sight, God, and you show us what life with you is like. Lord, I just ask for each of us today as we're following you, God, just show us more and more what it means to follow you in your ways of loving you and loving others. Teach us how to be more like you. In your name, amen.